So we'll make a start on the next session, but it is absolutely wonderful to hear all the discussion and the talk and the chatter and having the opportunity to exchange ideas and comment on what was talked about previously in the morning session, how it's prompted some discussion over morning tea. So really pleased about that. So moving on to the next session, the focus is really around variety and disease management. However, first up, I'm really pleased to say that we've got some pretty special BCG people up here, Ian McClelland and Trevor Grogan. And they are going to, well, Ian actually is going to run this very next session about talking about to Waffle about how we managed to grow such a good crop this year out where our BCG main trial site was this year. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Fiona. So we're going to turn this around. Instead of saying, why didn't our crop yield better, we're going to ask the question, why did it yield so well? So Trevor Grogan, he gave us a paddock in 1993, the beginning of the Birch Cropping Group. So he's always been very active in our group, which has been fantastic. So Trevor, tell us about your paddock.
Yeah, and first thing I'll say that farming's only a great big game. You do the best you can, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, and on that particular paddock I won this year, so it's only a game, so don't get too serious about farming, I'll tell you.
We just would like to catch up. Now, could we have the next slide, Fiona? So some examples around the region this year of really high yields. At Matoa, there was a barley crop went 8.2 after a wheat crop with a water use efficiency of 31. Lentil crop went 6.5 at Matoa with a water use of 24. A wheat crop. Oh yes, wheat after lentils. Then there was a wheat crop at Rapania went 6.1, which is 26, and yield profit predicted 5.7 tonnes per hectare. And at Warrington Beale, a wheat crop after vetch went 6.5 of a 32 kilograms per hectare. And the one we're looking at today on the bottom is Waffle's paddock, which is Scepter wheat, went 6 tonnes with a water use efficiency of 21. So, okay, Trevor, when did you start this paddock?
In January 19, we sprayed it. As the old saying is, bare paddocks, more weeds. I finished up spraying the paddock 9 times to get the broadleaf weeds out, and that's where you should have a detector spray, I think, so you can cut down those chemicals you're putting on the paddocks, but that's about where it started, and then all the rest was a bit of luck.
Okay, we'll start going through. We have a lot of information about this paddock because the BCG trial site was in the middle of it. So if you go to the next slide, so there's the sprays. He started on in January with that combination of Roundup, and he did it again the second month, and he then did it in the 9th month and the 12th month, keeping those weeds out. Now, when you sowed, can we just go to the next slide? We'll come back to that one. No, the next one. No, go back. Yeah. So the BCG did a Predictor B test on the paddock, and they found there was no root disease. They also did a water holding capacity in March before sowing, which I think it had 180 millimetres of stored moisture, and it also had a nitrogen of 280 kilograms of N in the paddock before sowing. Okay, Waffles, what did you do in 2020?
We started doing. Well, it's all sprays, so I don't know if you got all sprays there. How many times I sprayed it in 20 again. Once again, broadleaf weeds, flea vane, binty eye, marshmallow, melons, heliotrope, cereals, whatever you get, it was there. A whole lot. So we just had to keep spraying it to keep it clean, and that's a plus. You must keep it clean. And so finished up, then we sowed it in, when we sowed in?
You sowed it on 14th of May.
14th of May.
And if you'd known you had 280 kilograms of nitrogen, would you have put your urea on?
No, I didn't know that. I don't worry about those things. It's not a part of my eyesight. I just look at the crop and say it wants it, so I put it on. I don't.
So
Too excited.
during the growing season, he put out 2 lots of 60 kilograms of urea, and the sprays are there as well. So we go to the next slide. Now, Trevor, you had 180 millimetres of moisture, and this graph here is one way of testing how much moisture you may have had in the soil, where you use 25% of summer fallow efficiency rainfall. So it says rainfall in millimetres, that it really had up to 300 millimetres up to sowing time. Go to the next one. Yield profit predicted, the blue line on the right predicted 7.2 tonnes possible, which is probably not too bad really considering.
Yeah, but had I got the same rainfall Bomber gets, well, I would have got 7 tonnes.
Yes, we all know there's good soils around the country and there's Cario soils. That's an in-joke. Next one. So this is the stored moisture in the soil. You can see it really went down to 140. Now these soil samples here in front were taken yesterday on the paddock, and you're welcome to come out and have a look at them. This one is on the lighter side of the paddock, and this one's on the heavier side of the paddock. We found roots right down to 1.2 metres, so it really had a opportunity of using all that moisture, which some of the other soils around the countryside don't. So it's a very well structured soil. Would you agree with that, Waffles?
Looking at it there, it probably is. I don't get in that deep. I don't have a clue.
Now, anyone like to ask any questions any time, just please, or you think you can contribute to this yield. Next one. Now, can we just go back there? Sorry, starting moisture was 197 mils here on the 27th of March. Okay, go to the next one. So nitrogen management, starting with 314 kilograms per hectare, applications 45, made on the 14th of May and the 19th of June. So you really maybe this is a good point to say, maybe this is James Hunt's view of how we should manage nitrogen in the soil by having a large amount of nitrogen up front. So, Waffles, tell us what happened after that, after sowing.
Well, you're saying one day that's the best wheat crop you see in the Mallee. We didn't see it after we put Talonor and MCPA on it. And I'll tell you what, it wasn't pretty, driving past it every day and having a look at how yellow it was, and where the boom didn't cut off properly, it just went real yellow, going brown. And that wasn't supposed to happen out in front of the cropping group because that hurts the pride. So, but anyhow, we finished up, we put a litre of Waken on it to try and get it going. Then I think that after that we put that over 60 kilos of urea on it, trying to spark it up a bit, and finished up. It'd come back and you wouldn't know anything was wrong with it. But it did look very sad there for 6 weeks, I can tell you.
Next slide. So these are just some of the yield profit models. It's the one on the top right shows you that really it didn't have a nitrogen problem, which we probably could have guessed. The nitrogen stress on the right bottom one really didn't come till season was over. And the top left it shows you where the moisture was in the soil and how it was used. And the third one is the water stress. It says there was slight water stress from October, but I think it was nearly over by the 1st of October. Most people started harvesting in early November. Okay, next one. So there's 2 methods of measuring water use efficiency. The first one comes out at 17.4, and the other one, which is yield profit over stored moisture plus growing season rainfall less evaporation, of 110, which is It may be old-fashioned technology, but it gives you a bit of an idea of his water use efficiency of 18.3 worked on those methods. So tell us about harvest. It must have been fun, was it, Trevor?
It was sitting on the header, yeah, it was very good. So you don't see that very often. Well, you farm to see these things because you don't know what's going to happen. You sow it and that sort of result, and it's good to sit on the header and watch it doing it. So people said, why didn't you take a photo on your camera? And I said, well, I've got it in my head, I don't need a camera to remember what the crop went.
The other interesting information about this paddock is this is the maximum minimum temperature throughout the year. And it says at growth stage 65, which is middle flowering, was like 2nd of October. Now, that was a day we had 3 days over 30 degrees. Now, we know that transpiration starts to happen rapidly after 28 degrees, but it didn't seem to affect the yield. Maybe yield profit got it slightly wrong and probably flowered before those 32. But if you look at that graph, virtually apart from those 3 days in October, there were no days above 28 degrees for the whole of the growing season. And if you look at frost, 0 degrees at the bottom, there was one frost, what was 10 at about the 28th of September, but obviously missed it. So virtually that temperature data is also very interesting to see how it had quite a mild finish, and so the crop was able to really maximise its yield. Is there another one? That's all. Okay, Trevor, information I haven't got. What was the protein of the wheat?
I went between APW and Hard 2, so that were around that 11.5 all the time.
11.5. Now they say if a crop has 11% protein, then it used all its nitrogen. Anything less than that, they say you should put more nitrogen on. So he obviously got his nitrogen right for 6-tonne crops. Any questions?
There's one there. Oh, Ian, you might read that.
Can we bring the sowing date forward? In other words, shorter. What would you prefer to have sown that crop earlier, Trevor?
No, that's usually the time we sow it.
14th of May.
14th of May, that's about time.
Well, yes, I agree with your question. I think I would have preferred a little bit earlier myself, but, well, the proof's in the eating, and I think he's done it probably pretty right. Any other questions? Yes, Georgie.
One here first, sorry.
Yeah.
Sowing rate for seed, and related to that, any like tiller counts in the spring?
I think,
60 kilos of wheat and 80 kilos of fertiliser.
Also, we had a phosphate test done on the paddock, and it had 28 kilograms of phosphorus based on coal wool. So that was enough phosphorus to grow a 6-tonne crop. So basically all the factors that produced the crop were pretty well in the right area. Any more questions? James?
Any fungicides?
Any fungicides?
I put, what's the name on it? On the fertiliser. No, not after, no.
Okay, so there wasn't a striped rust year this year, James. Georgie?
I texted it through.
Oh. Was there any difference visually or in protein or yield between Vixen and Scepter?
Well, I can't answer that. I was looking Scepter, I don't know what the yield went. What's the name? I don't know what the yields went.
Okay.
On the cropping group side.
So, Kelly?
They just said the Vixen was 6 tonne.
They were the same.
Same yield.
Same yield. Next question is by Anonymous. Why is the water use efficiency so low? Opportunity for a better result. Okay. Would he have been better if he'd grown 2 crops than just one with Longfellow? Trevor? 2 3-tonne crops are pretty handy all the same, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so, because Just another problem, I had another paddock up the back west of there, it was on sand, and where the crop was, it was still 6 tonne on the same program. But the problem I had was I had 3 salt patches up there, which I called them minor salt patches. But now those salt patches are major salt patches. There's probably 10 times worse, or it could be worse, in some of the patches where the salt is, because I didn't have a crop the year before. So this is where you win and lose at times, and I've lost there by miles. So I've got to try and sort it out. So it is a big problem.
Okay, the next question, which is a very interesting one, how did the available land get so high prior to fallow?
Is it well fed or a legume?
Yeah, so, I mean, you must have had a very fertile history of the paddock over a number of years, Trevor, to be able to, 1 year fallow, to accumulate so much nitrogen.
Yeah, well, actually that part of land where the cropping group is on, that cost me a lot of money. It used to be going back years ago where they had the horses and all that, and that's the first place I sowed lentils, and they went 2.5 tonne a hectare. And then I thought, this is the way to go, this is how you make money. So the next 3 years in a row, I paid $5,000 for seed for lentils and never stripped them, so
So it
can cause problems.
It put all the nitrogen in the paddock. Okay, any other questions? There's one over here. Tim. I think the other question while he's getting to Tim is the rainfall throughout the spring rainfall, May, June, July were fairly dry, and you had quite good August rain, low September rain, then above average October rain. I know that Z. Hockman, who from CSIRO, we asked him once to do a trial with yield profit. So when's the most important month of the year to have rainfall for a crop? And he came back with the answer, August. So as long as you sow your crop on time, he always maintained that the most important month for rainfall for a crop was August. Tim.
So Waffles, why did you fallow it in the first year? Considering we had great summer rainfall, coming out into 19, I'm assuming it's a weed problem. So the question is, would you do it again? Because what you're effectively doing by having the fallow and then getting a 6 tonne crop at the end is you're transferring the risk of 2 seasons into one. Given those sort of factors, would you do it all over again?
Well, I would do it not on the paddock it's got the salt on. I've got some there now at the moment. It's doing the same thing. Just give them a spell and don't have crops on them. So that way you can use any chemical you want to clean up your weeds. But it's the same program. It's one paddock said 10.5 litres of glyphosate, 4 litres of gramoxone and amine, and I don't know what else. I've been on those paddocks already. So then you start calculating your costs to do it. Maybe you're better off just sowing crops and don't worry about it. It's only the reason I've done it for is just so that when you get a dry year where you get the benefit of the crop. But in long term, spraying it 7 times and 8 times, well, you're better off shunting a crop on it. And don't worry, just have average crops.
So is this a reason for having some long paddock, fallow paddocks on our farm? I think that's another question.
Yeah, it probably is, but it's just what I said. Is do you want to do that and keep spraying them? Because all you do is spray. The weeds only come up because there's moisture. You saved your moisture and you lose it. We've got to keep the weeds out. So you just got to keep spray. But you need to detect the spray if you're going to do that program.
Any other questions?
I think that might be it.
Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Ian.
Thanks, Trevor.
Waffle. Well, true to form, I've let everything go completely over time, so we're now running a bit behind, but that's okay. It was a great discussion. Next up, we have Claire Pickles from BCG, who's going to talk us through her topic on super cereals, how varieties stacked up in 2020. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks for that, Fiona. I can cut this short if everyone wants me to. So for those that are following along in the e-books, this is on page 56, so how the varieties stacked up last year. So first off, we'll just have a quick recap on cereal maturity classification. So there's been a slight tweaking in the namings that we now classify the varieties as. No changes to the actual varieties themselves. So previously you might have been a fast, mids and long varieties. Now they're going to be more referred to as very quick, such as Vixen, Mid, Scepter. And this is developed by the Australian cereal breeders as a guide for cereal development and consistency across everything. So a few examples, mid-spring, so it's all a quick wheat boundary and a slow wheat boundary. So if you start seeing this terminology throughout the year, that's what that refers to, but no actual changes in the varieties themselves. And this will be how they're sort of referred to throughout the talk and also throughout the paper. So now looking at our sowing windows, which follows on quite nicely from what Waffles just said. So he said the 14th of May, and he wouldn't go any earlier than that. I guess one thing to think about is understanding the maturity, the variety that you've got, and knowing when to prioritise it and when to sow it. I guess historically we know our yield is maximised when sown in the first 2 weeks of May. However, achieving that across the whole farm is not going to be possible. There's only going to be 7 days in the week, so you can't really get there. But some work done by Bonnie Floor at Cyro and also James Hunt has shown that over the last 50 years, the median sowing and flowering dates to try and hit that optimal flowering period, say for somewhere like Hopetoun in the Mallee, is the 8th of September. So flowering then over a long period will give you the greatest yield, which equates to a 10th of May sowing date based on a mid-maturing variety such as a Scepter. Whereas at Longerenong in the Wimmera, it's more like the 7th of October as your optimal flowering period, which equates to a sowing date of the 16th of May. So as I sort of alluded to, you can't get the whole thing right in that window, but understanding what maturities you have got can help you make a bit of a plan, and getting it right can equal some more dollars, maybe even a 6-tonne crop, Waffle. So let's look at how the wheat, let's start on wheat. So we're looking here from 2016 to 2020. So we're looking at 5 years of GRDC funded national varieties, the NVT, and this is MET data. So it's multi-environmental trial data. So let's look at the green lines first. So the green is depicting the Mallee. And I've just picked a benchmark variety of Scepter where I've put the green line straight across there. And the left-hand side is showing our percentage of site mean. So any green bars above the Scepter there are showing which one. So we're seeing Ballista, Vixen, Rockstar, Catapult all performing equal to or better than Scepter across that 5-year period. Looking, I guess, at the Wimmera now, so looking at the orange bars, we're also seeing varieties Ballista, Vixen, Rockstar, Scepter. So there was a few consistencies there in what's yielding the top in the Mallees, also going the top in the Wimmera environment over the long term. Towards the right-hand end, we're also seeing a few advances in the Clearfield area too. So we're noticing that Hammer is yielding more than Grenade. Hammer's a fairly new variety. Then Razor, probably a more commonly grown Clearfield line, also out-yielding Grenade too. But I guess of interest is Sunblade CL Plus there. That's been in the NVTs for 2 years and it's sort of out-yielding a couple of the other Clearfields. So it's worthwhile considering that. But it's also really worthwhile considering, will a change in the variety achieve what you're wanting to achieve at the end of the season? Will it yield an extra 10% to warrant the cost of changing the seed? So picking out some of those higher yielding ones across the long-term data, disease ratings and quality. Just highlight a few here. So Scepter, which I think you're all fairly familiar with, yielding a little bit better than mace, a better rust package than mace, although we did see in last year that that did need managing in some certain situations. Vixen, a quick maturing variety, so another one there to sort of look out for. And then down to the Clearfields, we're seeing Razor CL Plus, probably one of the better ones there. And then Sunblade at the bottom, just noting that that's an AH quality, so it's going to be above the ASW of Razor. Okay, changing tact now, moving across to barley varieties. Again, we've got a similar thing here where we're looking at 2016 to 2020. So I encourage you to look at things over multiple years and not just how they performed just last year. In the Mallee, I guess the average barley yields were about 3.6 tonnes per hectare last year across the 8 Mallee NVT sites. And in the Wimmera, across those 4 NVT barley sites, about 4 tonnes per hectare. This time we're going to start off with the Wimmera, so looking at the orange bar there, sitting around about the top of where Compass is. So there is a few varieties that are outperforming Compass. I think Compass is probably fairly commonly grown in the Wimmera. We're seeing RGT Planet, Rosalind, Leebrook, Fathom, also yielding quite well there too. Beast is another one that been in the MVTs for 2 years, and that's a quick maturing, similar plant type to Compass and suited to a low to medium rainfall zone. Next one now, looking at the Mallee Barley on the green line, so I've put that along the top of where Compass is. I'll just get the pointer going. We can see that there's not really too many up above that, giving you 10% greater. Again, similar varieties doing quite well from the Mallee to the Wimmera region. Looking towards our Clearfield lines, we're seeing Maximus, which has out-yielded Spartacus. I know Spartacus is a fairly commonly grown Clearfield, but of interest would be this, if you're a Mallee farmer, it would be Commodus CL. So that's the sister line to Compass, but it's got the Clearfield trait in it. So that's something to look out for. There's no seed left for this year, so 2022. It's quite vigorous, probably suits those weedier paddocks on the sandhills maybe. But my suggestion would be not for a Wimmera area because it probably will lodge a bit, just like Compass does. Disease ratings and quality. So there's a lot of information here to take away. So I guess with barleys, particularly wanted to highlight to you Planet because that's done fairly well. There's going to be some disease issues with any of the varieties you've got there, but it's about understanding what issue it is and then managing it accordingly. I think the yield advantage that you're going to get with Planet is going to outweigh the fact that you might have to put a bit of control out for net form, net blotch. And the other one I wanted to highlight down the bottom was the Clearfields. It was Maximus, which as of yesterday heard Intergrain announce that that is now a malting variety. I was hoping to get the characteristics on Commodus, the new one, but didn't quite come through in time. So I guess the growth habits there are all listed are the different barleys. If you are looking for a competitive one for a certain situation like weeds, erect versus the prostrate habits. So I guess think about that if you are selecting a variety. One thing I wanted to just, I guess, point out here was Planet. It's in the NVT and the GRDC guides as being a quick maturing variety. However, I guess we're finding it probably has a bit of a longer, more mids, probably even a bit later in terms of its flowering. So just have a quick diverge here to another trial, and this was a sowing date trial done at Pyramid Hill with 8 different barley varieties. So we can see when Planet was sown on the 26th of May, it flowered about the 3rd of October. And then when it was sown on the 4th of May, It flowered around about the 22nd of September. So it's still, even, I guess, marketed as a quick maturing variety. I think it's got a fair bit of elasticity and flexibility in when it may actually flower. In the MVTs, in the Mallees, we're noticing it flowered about the 17th of September in 2020. Okay, so what now? We've got all this variety information. I guess I've put a few here as ones to sort of look out for and watch. Vixen is a quick maturing variety, so that's something that you would not look to sow too early. Probably a later one. Rockstar and Catapult are varieties that are very flexible in terms of their sowing window. They can be sown quite earlier as you're getting a bit later, perhaps moving towards a sceptre. Raise is certainly a good clear field at the moment, and then worth watching would be Ballista and Sunblade. In terms of the barleys, I've just highlighted a few here. RGT Planet is a fairly good all-rounder. Roslyn, Lee, Brook and Fathom all yielding quite well. They may be feeds, so not the malt characteristics, but I think last year probably the difference is not there, so in terms of malt and feed to warrant the price drivers. I think it's more about picking the variety that you want and the maturity group for your farm and then managing that accordingly. Compass, I think it's just logistically, we saw a few people windrowing paddocks, particularly around the southern Mallee last year. Maximus is probably a Spartacus replacement if you're looking for a replacement. Otherwise, if you're in the Mallee and you're on Spartacus, I would just sit tight and maybe watch Commodus for another couple of years. But just really ask yourself, why you're going about making a change. Look at the varieties over a few seasons before just jumping onto something after perhaps only 1 or 2 years. Is my suggestions there, because you probably need to see at least a 10% yield increase to justify the cost of going and purchasing new seed and that sort of thing. So just following up with our what nows, we've got all the variety information, but I thought I'd just put a very summary page here on some action points for you when you go home today. If you're thinking forward to sowing this year, 2021 sowing and planning, I guess when you might sort of sow some of these, looking probably, I guess, at our Catapult and Rockstars. Mid-slow maturing varieties have got a fairly wide window there in terms of the last week of April and the first 2 weeks of May. Then getting more towards like the mid-maturing Sceptre in the second week there. Sorry, the pointer's just frozen, so if I just do that, it might move again. And then I guess getting down to a very quick maturing in Vixen, so the second week of May. So just, highlighting there, really make a bit of a plan about when you might sow the various varieties rather than just going out and changing for the sake of changing. Thank you. Any questions? James?
What's the CCN rating for all those wheat and barley cultivars, Claire?
That's a very good question, James, and off the top of my head I can't tell you them, sorry. I think unless someone else in the room wanted to make a comment on some of those newer ones, whether they've got better tolerances than others.
Can you ask James when the last time was that he saw CCN?
Yeah, okay, James, when was the last time you saw CCN? When scope was widely grown in the Mallee.
2 or 3 years ago.
Sorry? We can look, I can't look it up right now, sorry. I can. Ian?
Is there any comparisons between the winter wheats and the spring wheats in terms of yield last year, or?
Sorry, Ian, I haven't looked at the spring wheats, the winter wheats in terms of how they've yielded against the winter wheats. Well, winters versus spring, sorry. Unless anyone else had a comment they wanted to make about that. Yep, I'll get back to you, Ian, at lunchtime, sorry. Any other questions?
Great job, Claire. There's a huge amount of work goes into those MVT trials, and to synthesise all the data and bring it together in best bet options with all the considerations that you have, it's a tough job, and there's plenty of things that we need to follow up and that we can compare and add to. So thank you for that. So now we move on to pulses. So if I can invite Jason Brand to come forward and take this next session. So really looking at the Wimmera Mallee Southern Pulse agronomy trial work that's been happening across the region. There's no better person to talk about it than Jason Brand.
Thanks, Fiona. And we're probably going to race through things pretty quickly today because obviously you're covering a number of crops really, in a short period of time. I'm happy to take questions and further discussions. We'll continue to present data. We're not just going to focus on varieties. There's a lot of agronomy stuff in here as well. So we'll just jump straight into it and see where we land. So 2019, pod drop in lentils. It's a big issue. We know across a lot of southern Australia. Hallmark, we know a lot of guys were chasing in 2019 because it was dropping pods very quickly. So we thought in 2020 we'd have a look at some agronomic treatments, some really basic stuff around looking across different varieties, sowing directions, and then stubble height as well at different sites. So this one's up at Currio there, where we looked at north-south versus east-west sowing, and then a couple of different row spacings, so that 18 centimetre and 36 centimetre row spacings. And a whole heap of different varieties which cover the spreading types through to the more erect types. So to give you an idea of what we were covering, so you've got your Jumbo 2 there, and so that's midway through your season. You can see Jumbo 2's closed completely on the 36 centimetre row spacings, as against a Hallmark, which is still standing up all right, and then Bolt being fairly erect. So just keep all this in mind when we have a look at the results in a few moments. This is getting closer to harvest, and our boys had a nightmare trying to harvest some of those more erect lines, particularly when they were north-south. Because of the wind and that, they tend to fall all sorts of directions, and so we had some major challenges harvesting. Yeah, they're great erect. They're great when they're sown inter-row into standing stubble. At Currio last year, the stubble was cut fairly short, so we didn't really have that. We weren't able to look at the standing stubble effect. We did do that down at our Horsham site. So we'll dig a bit more into that hopefully in the 2021 season, but let's just stick to the north-south versus the row spacing this year. I'm not going to spend a long time on this because there's a lot of data here and I'm going to summarise it. Firstly, if we're talking about varieties, let's just talk about Jumbo 2. In terms of yields, and this is the variety snapshot for people and lentils. In terms of yields, Jumbo 2, Bolt and Ace are still topping the charts when you don't have weed issues or herbicide residue issues, okay? That's just stood out over and over again, generally long term, and I'm hearing it around the industry as well. So that's my quick snapshot in terms of varieties. In terms of your IMI ones coming through, so you've got your Hallmarks, you've got Hurricane, you've got Kelpie, and you've got Highland. They actually fit in a nice grouping and they're going to have little fits depending on where they are in the landscape. So some are going to fit drier areas, some are going to fit wetter areas, some are going to, Kelpie's got the larger seed size, so it may allow you to control weeds in a different way. So there's pros and cons with all of them, but one standing out above another at the moment doesn't look like it really comes through in the data. So let's just focus on this data and draw them together in terms of spreading, erect and flat types. And so I want to just show you some data here. And if you have a close look at this graph here, so if we firstly focus on the north-south sowing direction, the big thing that we noticed was the yield stability within the spreading types. So both north-south and east-west and between the row spacings. So pretty much, Jumbo 2 yielded 3.4 tonnes across the whole lot. You go to the erect types, so that's starting to group your hallmarks, your hurricanes, bolts. We started to see these big swings in terms of yield stability across the two different, both north-south and the row spacings as well. So, and a lot of that is related to harvestability, but it's a bit more than that because we actually checked how much we were leaving behind. And so we probably need to dig a little bit more into this, a longer term in the future. But initially, you know, this was the sort of the side thing because we're actually looking for differences in pod loss. So let's just come back there, is that last year we didn't really see much pod drop at all. Or shatter at all. So we actually did do the full assessment on this trial, and Hallmark was the worst of the varieties. But even then, when we counted seeds, we're only losing about 100 kilos of seed on the ground at harvest. And so that's only equivalent to about $65 a hectare. So unfortunately, last year we really didn't get much response in terms of pod drop and pod loss when we were looking at row space, row direction. So that's why we're sort of keen to have a look at these trials again across a range of different varieties in the future. So yeah, so that just highlights the sort of the numbers and that were the responses that we're getting across the different treatments. So quick snapshot, lentil brodal tolerance. And again, this is picking up on the variety stuff. Something's been noted, Jumbo 2 has often been noted as being hit a bit harder by brodal, and you can see that in this photo here compared to Hallmark. So Hallmark is definitely standing out in terms of having a little bit better brodal tolerance. And so we looked at, you know, can we develop a bit better screen for brodal tolerance and look at higher concentrations, and just focusing on that 4-node stage. So we've applied it at different stages and different rates. And what you can see is in terms of herbicide damage, Jumbo 2 was obviously a lot worse than Hallmark, and that did translate slightly to yields, but not that much. So at the recommended rates of brodal, generally we weren't getting much of a response at all in terms of yields, but it's just highlighting the fact that there are quite big differences in some of the varieties. And, you know, this might have some benefits down the track, you know, in those seasons where brodal damage does come through, and even on the soil types where brodal is more damaging. So this was actually done down around Horsham, so you're on the black cracking clay, so where brodal is not as much of a problem. So, you know, you get up onto some of the sandier soil types, it's going to give you a little bit more leeway with a variety like Hallmark, which really did stand out across the lines that we compared last year. Skipping through, just want to bring through some of the new technologies that are coming through. The Group C herbicide resistant line, so this is one of the GIA metribuzin tolerant lines, and it is specifically tolerant to metribuzin. So it's going to give us some really good options in terms of managing weeds going forward. The key things to note with this is that it is metribuzin tolerant. It's not necessarily going to carry that. Cross tolerance doesn't always carry through across all chemicals. So that's just something to note coming forward, and we'll provide more data as that comes to hand. But it's certainly something that we need to be aware of as an industry, that as we have varieties released with different herbicide tolerances, that sometimes it doesn't cross over across groups, as we have learned in the Group Bs currently. The Group BI type tolerances that are coming through, so again, GIA have got a line that has got improved tolerance to residual concentrations of Lentil in the system. And yeah, and so they're going to have some issues initially. They're more that branching type, they're shorter, bit more difficult to harvest, but they certainly will have a fit where potentially we might run into some of those issues with residues going forward. So yeah, just wanted to bring those ones forward. I didn't really want to explain the graph and so much, but just highlight some of the stuff that is coming through pretty close. So we should see that soon. So one other little thing we did with Hallmark, one of the issues we have noticed, and we've seen it with marketing with Hallmark this year, is Hallmark has this distribution in seed size, and also it sort of flips and flops between the small and mediums and largest. So we actually screened some seed coming out of the 2019 trials, and we graded them from less than 4 mil to greater than 5 millimetre seed. So what you can see is this is just the trial this year, and you see a little bit of biomass difference, just in terms of growth when we looked at the less than 4 mil versus 5 mil. There wasn't really much other differences there. So if we looked at the results, what we saw is that obviously at the end of the day, there's pretty much no difference in terms of grain yield, biomass production, etc. Obviously, you've got different sowing rates, so there's a cost saving there if you're able to use smaller seed. The big thing that came through was, and we just picked up this data the other day, yesterday, was that when we sowed the larger seed, it has actually ended up with larger seed, so 4.7 gram seed. So that's actually a really important marketing component, because when we're sowing the smaller size seed down the bottom here, we're back down around that 4 grams per 100 seed. It'd be nice to rerun this sort of trial in a tighter season when we actually have a really tight finish and see the distribution in seed size. So we've actually plotted out the full distribution in seed size here. So we're going to continue to investigate this one, and particularly with varieties like Hallmark, which have got that bit of variability going on, and that importance of, what seed do we actually grow? So just little small things there. So just quickly, in terms of new varieties coming through, just wanted to touch on the two of them. GIA Leader. So this is one released by Grains Innovation Australia through PB Seeds. It's got the tolerance to the Group B herbicides. It's more in that mid-late maturity group, so it's probably more medium high rainfall type zones, and certainly some interest over on the York Peninsula and areas like that, with good disease resistances. And then we've got Kelpie, which is the largest seeded red lentil with Group B tolerance. And that's got, the key thing to note with Kelpie that you might need to watch out for is the ascochyta rating on it is MRMS. And so they did note in some of the higher risk areas they were getting a bit of ascochyta. And so, and we know that that's what knocked flash out of our system because of its susceptibility to asco. Favour beans. I want to skim a little bit quickly through favour beans. I've talked about 1225 over many, many years. We did get a flip-flop year last year in terms of results, in terms of beans. So normally, if we look at the one at 2020 here, normally AF 1225 is near the top of the trial. It was actually the lowest yielding line at Currier last year, and we reckon it was just due to that dry, cold period we had in the middle of winter. And that's when it flowered and tried to start setting pods, because all the late flowering and later maturing lines, i.e. PBA Zara and Bendoc, and we also had Amberley in this trial, which is really for the high rainfall zone. They all top the yields at Currier. So some interesting stuff there. But just saying that there is germplasm coming through, and then when we combine that with the ripping responses that we're seeing with Michael Moody and the group up there, and across a number of different pulses, that potentially, beans are going to start having more of a fit in some of our systems. When we start getting the soil amyrylation right, potentially we get some herbicide tolerance traits into them. There are opportunities there going forward, but again, there's huge amounts of variability. So at Coolanong, obviously we brought the ripping response, so the red lines there are the sand that's been ripped. We're out yielding the yields on the flat soil, whereas at Speed, we're still miles behind in terms of where we were on the flat soil there. So won't dig too much into that, but we're doing a lot more work around understanding why those responses are occurring and how we can best maximise those responses. Another one, I wasn't necessarily going to present, but then got asked to just show this one. We looked at a whole heap of favour bean seed sources across Southern Australia. So working with SeedNet, they sourced a whole heap of seed lots, and obviously you can see a whole range of different seed weights, different yield environments, germinabilities, etc. And what we found from both the trials at Currier and Gimbound last year, there was actually no yield difference, significant yield difference between them. The only major differences is that there potentially sites 1 and 5 had slightly better visual vigour and potentially were better in terms of the yields, but we didn't pick it up in terms of our trials. They were at the higher end in both cases, and they were noticeable all year. And sites 6 and 8 were visually the poorest. So, and then grain weight at harvest was all in that 58 to 61 grams. So even though we'd sown 52 gram seed, and it ended up being around 60 grams at Currier. And even though we'd sown 70 gram seed, it was 60 grams. So that was nice and even. So some interesting stuff coming out of Bendoc. The other thing with Bendoc, we noticed with the different seed sources, one of the other complaints is that with Bendoc, we've seen that crinkling of leaves and that midway through the season. It was consistent across all seed sources. So it wasn't associated with anywhere where it had been grown previous years. And we saw the same symptoms at all sites. And the other thing was we ran IMI chemistry over them, and basically every seed source responded the same to the IMI chemistry. It was all tolerant. So, because one of the things that we're a bit worried about in terms of beans is this outcrossing effect that could happen in time. So, so at this point, we checked all those things, and so it was very promising. Happy to talk more. Disease management in chickpeas, and this one goes back, and we ran this one with Josh Fanning. Quick one in terms of stubble effects. We did a standing stubble versus slash stubble trial last year looking at Striker and Genesis 90, and I think the results, you don't really need to say much more than look at the screen, because this is without a spray, so we didn't actually spray these treatments. Just the stubble effect alone, Josh puts it as though it's like increasing your resistance level by 1 level sort of thing. So just highlighting that importance of stubble. We were interested in the way the disease was moving. I don't want to dig into that here because we were studying a little bit more about that movement along stubble rows, etc. We were a bit surprised by the significance of the response. So obviously highlighting that importance of your farming system and standing residue for disease management. I just wanted to throw this one up because Josh has been doing a lot of work on different disease management packages and looking at a whole range of different products on chickpeas over a number of years, and this summarises the economic advantage compared to an unsprayed treatment. So that top treatment up there is like a Bixafen, which we've applied post-infection. So we've actually applied it as soon as we saw the disease. And then we were looking at the relative yield responses. And so what we're learning out of this is that there is potential with some of these new products and the way we manage to actually apply fungicides post-infection and still provide economic control. Doesn't always look pretty, so that's the only problem I have with it. So as an agronomist, I look at it and going, oh gee, I don't know whether I want to see this disease in the crop. But in terms of when you put it down to dollars and cents and you look at the yields and economics at the end of the day, it came out that some of those post-infection sprays were quite economic and a potential way we can look at things in the future, particularly if we can make a better decision around spraying. New varieties, you've got PBA Magnus coming through and CBA Captain. Magnus is a large seeded Kabuli for the medium to higher rainfall environment. So it's certainly fit in the Wimmera, probably not so much up through the Mallee. And CBA Captain could have a fit through the Mallee as, this new Desi type. Just depends on how it's going to stack up against Striker. It's got a much more erect plant type, so that's where it may fit. Harvestability, but in terms of yield gains, it's probably on par with your Striker Gen 90 type yield levels. And in terms of disease, it's no better than Striker, so it's probably not quite there with Genesis 90 in terms of disease resistance coming through. Coming towards the end, just as a quick snapshot, so field peas. some exciting stuff coming through. Again, with GIA, they've got a couple of IMI tolerant lines coming through. So you've got GIA Alstar, which is the first dun pea with improved tolerance to in-crop residual and IMI herbicides. So, pretty much similar to the tolerance you get in the lentils at the moment. And then Castar has got tolerance to IMI residues, but not the SUs. So there's no registration for products in here yet, so it's more a residue management tool. But coming forward, obviously, there's probably going to be opportunities for both these lines. In terms of yields, they're probably not quite there yet. So Castar's down a fair bit, and Alstar, they're probably that 10% down on your top yielding lines. But obviously, when you put them in a situation where weeds or you've got residues involved, that's where this stands out. That's about it for me. We've got some veg, and James is going to take over from me.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Really good to see all those results coming through over a number of years of really hard work. So good to see. So vetch is a space that BCG has been playing in for a significant period now, and really starting to ramp up in recent times around its use on hostile soils. So a really good legume for in terms of managing risk on hostile soils. So. And this is one of the major reasons why. So in the past 4 years over at Pyramid Hill, so the top line there in every one of those years is, in terms of economics, has been vetch hay by and large. So sometimes driven by price, sometimes driven by yield, sometimes driven by both. But yeah, in terms of managing risk in a hostile environment, really, really solid option for those situations. In terms of sowing date, so I note that there's a little bit of vetch being scratched in already. Certainly probably not for hay as the target, but in terms of sowing date, so we can see here, this is a culmination of about 5 to 6 years of research. And regardless of how the season performs, generally the earlier we're sowing, the better yields we're achieving in vetch hay. Which again is no surprise to anyone, no doubt, but is important to note. In terms of cutting date, however, cutting date isn't really impacted by when we sow or when we germinate a veg crop. So we can see over, again, a range of different seasons. This is just for Morava vetch. Over quite a wide sowing window, so up to 6 weeks. Our cutting window is only a couple of weeks still. So there was a lot of vetch cut last year in late August, much closer to a higher risk or a higher perceived risk window in terms of weather damage and so forth. So, really something to be aware of is that regardless of when we sow, we're likely to be cutting in a pretty similar window. So a pretty key way to manage that risk at the back end of the season is through variety selection. So vetch only being a really small part of a lot of farming systems, many would think that the genetic diversity in the varieties is not that great, but it's actually not the case, and there's a couple of different species as well, which certainly helps the situation. But on the left here we have an image from Pyramid Hill from this year. So the big green one in the middle, so that's Benetaz, which is a really long season vetch suited to a higher rainfall environment. But we can see there that that's on the 28th of October, and quicker varieties such as Volga either side, sown a month apart, well and truly beyond cutting time. So it's important to note that the diversity in the varieties is the key to managing when we're going to cut at the back end of the season, and then controlling that quality as well. So and in terms of the yields there, I thought I would pop them in. It's certainly not a take-home message by any stretch of the imagination, but it's interesting nonetheless that a really long season variety in a season like we had was able to just tolerate the dry winter and then maximise in a really cool wet spring. So the long seasons really boosted that yield. As I said, certainly not a take-home message at all, but we'll keep seeing how these things progress over the years. So this is a bit of work that Jason and his team have done out at Currio from last year. And again, it highlights the concept of the longer season maturing varieties performing really well in that season. So Morava topping the yield in both sowing times, and again highlighting the concept of the early sowing, maximising veg hay yield. Even in a season where it was a bit kinder at the back end. So I'll just move on to a few agronomics now around gibberellic acid. So annually, about in the middle to late July, the phone always starts ringing and the questions start around, what does gibberellic acid do? Should I go and spray it? Will I get an increased yield? And so on and so forth. And it has been going on for some time, and no doubt will continue into the future, but we thought we'd just try and put some data on it rather than get too hung up in some of the good snappy photos that can come out of it. So on the left-hand side here, we can see Morava on the 18th of August, so that's about 2 weeks post a gibberellic acid application. So the left-hand crop, you can see is increased in height there relative to the right-hand crop in that left-hand image. So that application has sparked a response in the crop on the 18th of August. So when we get to the 1st of September, so another couple of weeks down the track, still a response there in terms of height. It's visual for sure, not quite as pronounced as it was closer to winter, but it seems as things are warming up, the two treatments are catching up to each other. So the heights were measured, so a 10 centimetre difference, still maintained there, that sort of 2 months post application. So we get towards the end of September and around cutting time, and we can see by the image and also the measured data that the height of the crop has caught up where it hasn't been applied with gibberellic acid. So we're achieving no difference in cutting height at that cutting time. So in a season such as this, no perceived benefit in harvestability from an application of gibberellic acid. In terms of yield, so they've both yielded just under 4 tonnes to the hectare. So again, haven't achieved a yield difference by making that application of gibberellic acid. Despite what we saw in the later part of winter, still haven't achieved that. The other piece is around maturity. So can we make an application to buy time when the crop starts to move really quickly? So in this image, the back half of these two plots side by side have had another application on top of the initial one in early September to try and hold back that flowering window to shift the cutting time a little bit later when the curing conditions are better. But we weren't able to achieve any difference in maturity by doing that. So so essentially we did not achieve any benefit whatsoever from 1 or 2 applications of gibberellic acid. So couldn't be advising it as a good method moving forward. So Jason and I will be happy to take questions. And the first question's already in, Jason. So in a broadacre situation, this is in terms of the row space by sow direction. So in a broadacre situation, would the losses be less in the erect varieties by harvesting on an angle as opposed to a trial situation going up plots?
Yeah, well, I guess the best answer to that was we got high yields when we harvested east-west versus north-south, so when we're harvesting into the fall of the crop. So absolutely, we always try and harvest into the fall of the crop, but obviously when you're sowing north-south, it's pretty hard to be harvesting into the fall on our small plot work. So yeah, no, east-west is always good, and yeah, harvesting into the wind, into the fall is great.
So the second question from one of the Tims in the room. It seems from your time of sowing in veg trials, it seems from your time of sowing in veg trials that yield has not declined with an early April sowing date. Do you have a sense of how early we could go? Early March, mid-March, February? I don't think we can push the boundaries that much. So yeah, I think that risk of being a bit too close towards the winter period with vetch in terms of curing, is probably a challenge. And I think the other thing to consider is the disease management implications of sowing a crop that early are pretty big. So you're going to end up with a really big, dense canopy in the middle of winter. And I can just imagine those diseases going absolutely rampant and being almost impossible to control. So I think early April is probably where we're at. And I mean, the other factor to consider is how many seasons is that going to be an option? It's a rhetorical question, but yeah, it's probably not going to pose itself all that often. I hope it does. But.
And I'll back that up because we had heaps of phone calls coming in, Josh and myself, about vetch and disease from guys that got in really early last year in some of the areas that got really early break. And yeah, there was some nightmare crops that they literally wrote them off because they just couldn't control disease. So we'd certainly have to have some really good strategies in place if you're going to go really, really early in those seasons. We get a really early break. I just yell it out. We'll repeat the question.
Just a question on the fungicide strategy you had there with the chickpeas, with the post-infection fungicide.
Post-infections, yep.
Yeah. So how did that compare to a complete preventative strategy? So there was difference versus control.
Yep.
The best post-infection control versus your preventative strategy, I suppose.
I think that one was the second one down, so there was a chlorothanol strategy. There is a full control strategy in there. Our full control in these trials is often you spray as many times as you feel like, because we're just trying to keep disease out. But this was actually, so we don't actually put the economics up for that treatment because it's unreal, but we normally put the strategic chloro type treatments. So yeah, I can run through that with you. We've got all the details, and there's a whole heap of other work behind that. Like there's dozens of trials. So, and same work in beans as well. Any other questions?
Hang-
About the whole Wimmera, but in the West Wimmera this last season, Bendoc beans performed very poorly compared to Samira's.
I'll repeat this, yeah, sorry.
I'm not sure about in the NVTs, but in many farmers in our district, sowing the same time in the same paddocks, there was mostly 800 kilograms to a tonne to the hectare difference, and we had the same experience. And to be honest, we were very disappointed in them.
Yep, so the question was reflecting on, the first part of the question was about that Bendoc was performing relatively poorly compared to Samira in the West Wimmera. And it's not just the West Wimmera, we saw it in other locations last year. The specific reason for that, we're probably unsure of at this point. A couple of things to note is Bendoc is definitely more susceptible to disease than Samira, and by a margin. So we would be suggesting that your disease management on something like Bendoc is going to have to be a lot more so. And then I'd have to have a look at when the flowering times fell. But yeah, we have heard that message around. Mind you, we wouldn't be expecting Bendoc to yield the same as Samira normally. You normally would expect Bendoc to be slightly behind Samira in terms of yields, but not the 800 kilos that you guys were seeing. That was way down. And yes, I agree, it was incredibly disappointing. So, yeah.
Jason, your hallmark seed size experiment indicates that it was probably released genetically mixed for seed size. Should growers be cleaning up their own seed to get the big ones, or are the breeding company or the marketing company going to re-release it, reselect it?
Well, it's certainly something worth thinking about. I was actually just talking to the breeder about that yesterday. So, yeah, like it would have been released. So they're selected through a single seed descent, fairly. So they actually are pretty mixed, you know, and all lentil varieties actually are a bit mixed. So maybe that is an idea. I wasn't quite expecting that sort of result. So we're interested to follow the seed through and actually, keep going with it. It was one of those side experiments you just think, well, we'll just chuck it in to see what happens, and it's probably showing something a bit more than what we're expecting. So yeah. And there's one more question down here that's just asking, has much trial work been done on growing lentils in paddocks with limestone? If so, any take-home messages to get lentils to yield? For me personally, no, we haven't done a lot of work on the limestoney type paddocks. It's one of those areas I think we really want to get into. It's one of those other constraints. For me personally, it's a bit of a passion because I did a whole PhD on that stuff, but we haven't done a lot of work in terms of the varieties and agronomics. I'm certainly aware of stuff that's done in the private industry where guys have played with nutrition, etc. But yeah, I think there's going to be a whole heap of things that we're going to need to do, much the same as what we are on the sandy soils with the ripping and then nutrition and inoculation. I think it's going to be a combination. So, but no, not a lot of work in that space yet.
Jace, just a question on the lentil yields. Obviously, you're getting around 3 tonne carryo, like in the Mallee, predominantly over the east way, a lot more closer to 1. Didn't seem to be anywhere near the differences between jumbo and those varieties then. Do you find that when the yields are a bit lower, or maybe hallmarks stand out a little bit better or the same, at least, as jumbo?
I think, Bolt would probably be the one that I would pick, you know, and those tougher soil types, like nothing seems to beat Bolt consistently. And we've seen that in trials. Jumbo 2 probably is that any good soils, any good areas, Jumbo 2, is hard to beat. So you go to the Wimmera, up on Pete's ground at Currio there, Currio soils, as we've talked about earlier today. Jumbo 2 is hard to beat. But yeah, I think as you get to those other ground, some of those erect types certainly will add some benefits. We're interested to see, there are some Jumbo 2 type IMI tolerant 1 lines coming through and should be available in the next year or two. So, because some people really like that plant architecture. So yeah, we see some benefits in that plant architecture as well in terms of harvestability.
Thanks, Jason. We might have to leave it there. So thank you very, very much. And thank you to James Murray, who's just having a bit of a coughing fit. So thank you very much for both of you for your presentations. And there's a small gift to you. Thank you. And I think Jason and James obviously will both be around at lunchtime if you want to catch up with them about anything that you might have missed. Okay, so we've got one more session before lunch and it's around blackleg management. So if I could ask our very own Steve Marcroft, Harm Van Rees winner from last year, please to come forward and take us through the next session around blackleg.
Hello, I'm a very feminine Steve. Rightio, thanks Fiona. So yes, this next session will be talking about blackleg in canola with a focus on upper canopy infection. And if anyone's anyone's following along in your ebooks, it's on page 142. So I'll be doing the first little section, which I've termed the what, which is going through some of our trial results from last year, where we ran a members funded trial out at Curio. Curio seems to be theming a little bit today. And Steve's going to follow up with part 2, which I've termed the why. And he's going to talk about why we got some of the results we did and what are some of the things we can do when we're looking at risk factors and deciding whether to spray or not for upper canopy infection. So just quickly, what is blackleg UCI? When I say UCI, I'm talking about upper canopy infection. It's a fungal disease. Sorry, I'm just a bit short. It's a fungal disease of canola and it's stubble-borne. And it's, you can see in this image here, it's that browning off of flowers, pods and branches in canola. So it really is that upper canopy infection. You may have heard it termed as aerial blackleg as well. So first off, why are we doing the research? So upper canopy infection has emerged with earlier sowing and therefore earlier flowering of canola crops. You may have heard a little bit more about it in more recent years. You may have seen it. You may have sprayed for it and not been sure whether you should have or not. And we're doing this research in the medium to low rainfall zones because fungicide application decisions are actually really difficult where you're not sure whether you're going to get that economic response or not. So we wanted to run this research and see if we could work out where that economic response position is. We wanted to look at some of the risk factors that are driving the decisions around fungicide applications as well. And of course, we wanted to see if we could get any yield benefits from application of fungicide looking at upper canopy infection. So this is the trial that we ran. I put in a drone photo because everyone loves a drone photo. So we had a time of sowing trial. As I mentioned, we seem to be seeing more upper canopy infection with earlier sown crops. So we've put in a really early sown March 31st, and then our second time of sowing is a fair bit later on the 5th of May. So we've got 3 varieties in there, Hyola 350 TT and then Stingray and Bonito. I've put in there their major gene resistance rating groups, which Steve will follow up a little bit more on when he comes up. And we had different fungicide timings. So we had Aviator X-Pro, we had a control with nothing applied, we had a 30% bloom application, end of flower application, and a full control, which had those 2 application timings, as well as a 4 to 6 leaf. When we look at the results, looking at our disease presence, so this is visually scored on a scale of 0 to 9. And what we see here is basically that we did see a higher disease severity of upper canopy infection in the earlier sown treatments, which are the dark grey bars there. And then when we look at our later sown treatments, we had next to no upper canopy infection symptoms when this was scored. Looking at our varieties, Stingray and Bonito, a lot worse infection than 350 TT, suggesting that Hyola may be displaying major gene resistance. Again, Steve's going to follow up on that a little bit. And we did some phenology on the trial. So just with our cereals, we have a optimal flowering window for canola, and I've highlighted that there in the green rectangle. So that's the optimal start of flowering window for burchip. On our y-axis, I've just got the varieties there, so running straight across will be one variety. Our dark black dots are our flowering times for the first time of sowing for those different varieties. So you can see earlier sowing, we flowered too early to hit that window. Our later sowings are the white dots with the black outline, and you can see there Hyola 350 is just tucked into the end of that optimal window, and our other 2 varieties were flowering a bit too late. The grey dots I've just put in there out of interest. So that was our NVT canola trial, which was just next door to this trial at the site, and that was sown on the 22nd of April. So all of those varieties on that sowing date fell within that window. And basically this is just a risk window. So flowering too early, you're probably at a higher risk of frost, and in this case, upper canopy infection. You might have a little bit more yield potential if you don't hit those issues. And then when you fall out the other end of the window, you've probably got a lower yield potential, but also a high risk of hitting that heat shock risk at the end of the season. So our fungicide application results, there is a table in the manual if you want to look at it in more detail, but in general, fungicide had no effect in the second time of sowing treatments, and that comes down to the fact that we didn't really have any disease in there. And when we looked at the earlier sown treatments, we did see that a fungicide application reduced the disease severity in upper canopy infection, not so much in our Hyola 350 treatments, because there wasn't as much disease in there. When it comes to yield, so many factors contribute to the potential yield loss when it comes to upper canopy infection, which Steve's going to elaborate on a little bit in a second. But the way things were looking, it looked like all the stars were aligning for Bonito and Stingray in the earlier sowing treatments to have a fair bit of yield loss. However, we did run into a fair few issues out there last year, and that's an image there of some of the mouse damage we had at the site, and then we also got knocked by birds later in the season, knocking pods off, and the yield data really just was not reliable enough to present, and no one would want to have presented it more than me, but yeah, unfortunately we haven't got the yield results for that, but Steve might come up and talk a little bit about some of the factors that may contribute to these yield losses in our environments from upper canopy infection, and some of the things we need to consider when we're making decisions around fungicide applications in our environment. So I'll leave the next bit up to Steve.
Thanks, Jen. Cool, we're on. Can you... So yeah, first, so really what I want to do today is just talk about what are the decision-making things you're going to go through when you decide to put a fungicide on or not. A lot of the work we have done is been in the higher rainfall zone, where we obviously have more blackleg, much easier to do, but I think there's a lot of things we've learnt over the last few years which are very applicable. Firstly, I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a GRDC funded project, and it is a national project. It's not just me doing all this work. So getting that, looking at how do our fungicides work. So this is our fungicide trials we do last year across Australia. And the first thing I want to talk about is that fungicide response is actually really predictable with blackleg. So even when we look at all our trials, you can see these yield responses, and we get this very, very often. And when we actually look at the way the fungicides work on the disease, it's incredibly predictable. The amount of reduction you get in crown canker, or the amount of reduction you get in upper canopy, is really, really predictable. But the issue is, although how the disease responds to the fungicides is really predictable, it's the predictability of how that then responds to the yield, which you actually make your money on, which is unpredictable. And I think this is the slide which probably more sums up with what you get. So these are our sites from last year. Obviously last year being a pretty good year for canola. But you can see here, what I've done here is I said if you'd grown Mako, which is an MR type cultivar. So it's a cultivar which in normal situations shouldn't get a yield response, but when you grow under high disease pressure, it certainly will. And when you put the fungicides on, if you said you wanted an additional 5% yield over your Mako with the seed treatment, all of a sudden you see there's lots of sites where you don't achieve that. So half the sites you do achieve that, and half the sites you don't. And if you look at the sites we've got there, they're all much higher rainfall, much more disease issues. So this is, I guess, the response that I'm constantly getting from agronomists. Agronomists are telling me, yeah, we're getting a 10% yield return, we're getting a 20% yield return, and then other agronomists are saying we got nothing at all. So what I want to do is try and talk about what are all the things we can think about when we're making that decision to actually, hopefully, know whether you're going to be one of those red cells or one of the green cells. So the first thing I want to note is that all the fungicides we put on canola are all broad spectrum. So we're controlling a whole range of different diseases, not just blackleg. So if you're going out monitoring blackleg, putting a fungicide on it, it might be that some other disease is actually giving the yield return. And I've just put this as an example because powdery mildew, it's turning up much more common these days, don't know why, but just by chance our 30% bloom sclerotinia sprays give it fantastic control. We saw at Lake Bolek last year one of our spray treatments gave us an extra 20% control for alternaria. So there's all these diseases, there's white leaf spot, there's alternaria, there's all these other diseases turning up. They're very regional specific. We don't know a lot about them, but we do notice that we get these different controls. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention. Sort of get out in your crops and know what diseases are actually in your crops. Here's another example of, I'll just put here, know your disease. The photo on the left there is white leaf spot. The photo on the right is blackleg. The photo on the left, or your right, whichever way, isn't, I don't think, going to cause any yield loss. If you look at both of these plants, and I'll see if I can use this pointer a bit better. This plant here, you can see the cotyledons are totally intact. The petioles are totally intact. This plant here on the right, you can see there the cotyledons are totally colonised and the petioles are collapsing. So that plant I would expect to get a yield response from blackleg. The other plant I wouldn't. So again, it's get out in your crops and have a bit of an idea of what you're looking for. The other big one that I see more and more is the effect of physical damage on plants and then the way fungicides respond to that. I could tell you all those photos there, you may get no yield response to a fungicide, but the combination of the fungicide and the physical damage to the plant drives the disease and will give you a big yield response. So these are all things which you as a farmer and agronomist can't control, but they're things which may mean why you get a 10% yield return in one crop and not in another. So on the first one there, you can see split stem seems to be a common problem. Split stems are fantastic for upper canopy. You get a nice big split along the stem, all the blackleg spores get in, and you get massive disease. The next one is a frost photo which was taken by an agronomist last year. Again, massive fungicide responses to frost damage. And the one on the right, which may be applicable to a lot of people here, is hail damage. So that was a photo I took in 2018. Hail damage, superficial, just spots on the pods, not going to cause an issue. Come back 2 weeks later and every single one of those damaged parts is a blackleg lesion, and you get a 20% return to a fungicide. So, like I said, these aren't things that you can actually change, but they're things that actually give you knowledge about why you may or may not get a response. So, okay, let's go through our decision making. The first decision making we're going to do is right at sowing. It's going to be our seed treatment or our fungicide on our fertiliser. The first thing I'd suggest you do is go to the Blackleg CM app, which we've been working with GRDC and DPIRD, so that you can get, it's just stuck there, but anyway, that you can, all right, I think I'm back under control. So you can download that on your tablet, and I'll go through that one a bit in a second, but that's the first thing that I do to put you on the map. The second one is really about scouting. It's about getting out in your crops and just looking at how much disease you've got each year. And if you're not getting disease issues, continue your current practices. If you are, there's a whole range of things you can change. And the third one I'll talk about there is the timing of germination, which we're realising is becoming a much bigger issue. So firstly, our Blackleg CM app, the great thing with the app is it's got all the cultivars in there, it's got all the blackleg ratings in there, it's got all the resistance groups in there, so it's got everything you need to know. And then you basically go in and you fill out the crop circumstances. So it's an economic app, so you put in your potential yield and then all the things which we know will affect blackleg. So the good thing with it is you don't have to remember anything about blackleg control. You just go in there and fill it out and it's got everything for you. And in this case, it's estimating that you're going to get a 20% yield loss from blackleg. So the first thing you can do on that is change your cultivar from an MS cultivar to an R-rated cultivar and you won't get any yield loss at all. Or you can see there it's got all the different fungicide options you can put in. So that's the first thing I would do to put yourself on the map to say, am I actually in a risk or not? And I've just put this slide here for those are the 11 sites I was talking about before. I've actually I've used our full control treatment there to look at the target yield, and then I've put in what the predicted yields were from the app and the actual yields achieved. And I think you'll see here that for the two fungicide treatments, the actual and predicted yields were really, really good. So they actually were pretty good at determining what you would get. For the untreated, the app has overestimated the amount of disease, but I think looking at really what happened last year, I'm not that surprised because last year the yields were very high, so the app was assuming there was going to be a lot of disease, but we did have that quite dry period through the middle of winter, so disease actually didn't become that severe compared to the yields we achieved, so I'm not too upset with that. The next thing is sowing time. As I said, sowing time has become a much bigger issue for us. So if you look at the photo there where I've got the April sowing there, you can see if your crops at the seedling stage are looking like that. So in an April sowing, we've sown into good warm conditions, the seeds germinated really quickly, the crops have got up and established, and they haven't got any blackleg on them before the blackleg starts coming in early winter. And this is a massive disease escape. So that we know it's the cotyledons and the first leaves which get infected, the pathogen grows within the vascular tissue down to the crown to cause the canker. So if you look at that bottom one there, that's the disease you get at the end of the year, which was a result of that seedling infection. So if you're sowing your crop in late May, your crops are germinating into early winter, they stay at that small seedling period through most of winter and they get infected right through that winter period. If you're sowing in April, you escape that disease. So there's a massive disease escape issue. So that's the first thing. So when we now move on, and we're looking at the foliar fungicides we're going to put on, so our next spray decision at the 4 to 10th leaf stage, again, I would go straight back to my Blackleg CM app because, again, you'll have a better idea of what your disease pressure is now and you'll have a better idea of what your target yields are. But the great advantage with this fungicide timing is that you can actually get out into your crops and actually have a bit of a scout and see what disease is occurring. So first one is how much disease is present. Again, what's the growth stage of my crop? Are the cotyledons and first true leaves infected? Because that'll drive that crown canker. What is the yield potential and other diseases? So if we look at this, this is really what I'm looking for when I go into a canola crop. So on the first photo there, you can see here the cotyledons aren't affected, the first leaves aren't affected, and it really doesn't matter what happens there, you know you're not going to get much crown canker. On the second photo there, this is probably more typical of what we see in the middle of winter. You have got leaves infected and whatever, and this is where you can potentially say, yes, I'm going to spray this crop and get a protection. But again, it's really now you need to know your blackleg rating of your cultivar. So, I keep pressing the wrong button, sorry. If you look at the different scenarios I got down the bottom there, if that was an R-rated cultivar, that's the type of disease you would expect at the end of the year, which is going to drive the yield loss. If it's an MR type cultivar or an MS type cultivar. So it's not just how much disease have I got on the leaves and if I'm going to put a fungicide on, it's how much disease have I got. I need the disease, it needs to be looking quite bad, but then I need to know how my cultivars are going to react to that disease as well before you make that decision. The other thing is we're talking about growth stages when you're out looking at your crops, and this was classic for last year. So disease really, I guess, became more severe later in the season. So we saw our seedlings were quite clean, and then we saw disease turn up, and people went out and spray because it looked really bad. But we know that at this particular growth stage, when all the leaf lesions turned out, it wasn't actually going to cause any yield loss because it was too late. The disease turned up too late to get into the crown to cause the crown cankers, and it had turned up too early to cause the upper canopy. So it may have looked bad, it may have done a lot of damage on the leaves, but it was never going to cause any yield loss. So again, it's that thing, know the growth stage of your crop when you make this. You need the disease, but you also need to have a vulnerable growth stage to get the yield loss, the yield returns from your fungicide. The last thing I'd say with scouting is the great thing is it means we can be prepared if we get those 1 in 10 years or whatever where all the stars align for the disease. And we saw this in 2016. It really didn't matter where you were. Put a fungicide on, you get a great yield return. So it's really nice to know we've got the technology there that when we do get those years, bang, we can just go and respond really quickly. So the last option we've got now to put fungicides on is what we're talking about today is our upper canopy. And look, be honest, we started working on upper canopy in 2016. So we're learning new major things every year. So I've got some more major findings to try and make these decisions more reliable. A lot of the upper canopy thing has been driven because we had this upper canopy. The first thing we did, we tried fungicides and we got 20% yield returns. And farmers tried it and got the same. All of a sudden, fungicides are going out everywhere, and yet we really didn't have the knowledge to know when and when we shouldn't use it. And that's where we're really trying to play catch up now. I know in the early days I would tell people, look, I don't know, I can't give you advice. And they say, well, we're going to make a decision, Steve, whether you tell us or not, we'd rather have your opinion. And that's where a lot of those early spraying decisions came from. So first thing is we can't use Blackleg CM because it doesn't exist for upper canopy, although we are working on that at the moment, and hopefully we're going to have a bit of a prototype out this year. The next things you want to look at are leaf lesions. No leaf lesions, you've got no issue. Leaf lesions at plant elongation now suddenly becomes critical. So it's again that growth stage when the disease is occurring, and then rainfall at that critical period for infection, date of first flower, and then there's a couple of other ones I'm going to run through now. So firstly, and Jen talked about this with your different sowing times, is the target of the first flower. So just this photo here, if we look at the more mature crop, if you get, the crop that which was, so if you just assume this was exactly the same cultivar sown at 2 different times, at the end of the year, we might see this type of level of infection from a later sowing. If it's sown earlier, we might see this level of infection. So timing or date of first flower we know is critically important whether you get the disease or not. That'll solve 80% of your problems. The next one is, and this is something we found last year in our experiments, was it's not just the timing of flowering. We thought it was if you flower earlier, you're more into the winter period where it's conducive for disease. And that's certainly true for getting the disease to turn up. But what we found is just as important, or maybe more so, is the time the disease has got from the infection to harvest. So blackleg, as we know from a crown canker, it gets in to the vascular tissue and causes a crown canker. It needs a lot of time to do that. So what we're seeing here, I'm going to use an example. If this was all the same plants sown in the same paddock, and then you harvest this plant here, they all got infected at the same time, but in 1 year you have a short season, tight spring, you've got exactly the same disease, but you don't get any yield loss. The second one, the season goes 2 weeks later, the disease has got an extra 2 weeks under that warm conditions to get into the vascular tissue and cause damage. You get a 5% yield loss. The next year, that period between infection and harvest goes an extra 2 weeks. You've done everything exactly the same and you get a massive yield response. So we've seen this level of infection occurs very quickly at the end of the season. And if you by chance harvest before it occurs, you don't see the yield loss. By chance you harvest after it occurs, you suddenly see this big yield response. So again, these are things you can't work out as a farmer when you're putting the fungicide on, but these are things which we know now will definitely drive the amount of yield loss you get. The other thing, this is some work done by Susie Sprague and Syro, is the spring rainfall and temperature will also drive the yield loss. So the way this works is you can have the same amount of disease, but in a wet, cool spring, the plants can tolerate more disease. So you can have, let's pick an arbitrary figure, 50% internal infection, it's a wet, cool spring, the plants can tolerate that, you don't see the yield loss. You've got 50% internal infection and you have a hot, dry finish and the plants are moisture stressed, the plants can't tolerate that and you get the yield loss. So in one spring you get an effect from a fungicide and the other spring you don't get an effect from a fungicide. So that's, again, another reason. And this is our latest findings with our GRDC funding last year in 2020 is genetic resistance. So we're talking about this, we knew, like Jen said, we knew that major genes protect the whole life of the plant, so they work for upper canopy infection. Our quantitative resistance, we were very confident only worked at the crown stage, and therefore if you're reliant on quantitative resistance, it didn't matter, they were all plants were equally susceptible. So if you've got an MR cultivar compared to an MS compared to an S, it didn't matter, they're all exactly the same resistance for upper canopy. Part of our funding is to develop a feeding typing system so we can screen germplasm for breeders, and in experiments last year, lo and behold, we found out we were wrong. So if you look at these two group A's, one's an MR, one's an S, there's the average in lesion length for upper canopy, you've halved it. With the group B's there, you've done more, etc. So what we're seeing now is that quantitative resistance is working just the same. It doesn't stop the plant getting infected, it doesn't stop the plant showing that lesion on the flowers or pods or whatever, but it does reduce the rate of the vascular colonisation of the disease. So again, I think this is going to be a tough nut to crack because if you look there, I put the example in there, Group C cultivars, it's all over the place. So the genetic resistance is still there, but we're suspicious that genetic resistance is different in different cultivars and whatever. So really, what we need to do is give you guys a blackleg rating for upper canopy as well, because by chance you may have put your fungicide on this cultivar here and get no yield response, or by chance you put it on the next cultivar and you get a massive yield response. At the moment, you don't know because there's no blackleg rating for that. But again, it's going to be a massive driver, I think, for whether you get those yield responses or not. So this is a real key thing, I think, going forward. We need to do a lot more work in to give you a blackleg rating for upper canopy. 30% bloom stage, and I'll finish up quickly, is scouting for disease. So this is the first thing I look at as your plants are coming up to that budding stage. Do I have blackleg moving up onto the upper leaves? That's the first indication to me that blackleg's still present in my crop, still active, and potentially may be an issue. When I get to my 30% bloom spray, get out there and look for infected flowers, peduncles and stuff, because that gives you a lot more confidence that you're going to get a yield response if you can actually see that damage. And probably this is the most important slide, is come back at the windrow growth stage and actually look for damage. What we now know is that all those little flowers and that could be very superficial and don't cause you any problems. What I want you to look for now is, has the pith been damaged? That's where we're getting much stronger correlations with yield loss. So I've got a few techniques I do now. I just walk through the trial plots and grab the whole tops of them and cut them all off, and then look for the damage with the darkened pith. Or once you get your eye in, you will see here these tops of these plants, I call them darkened branches, they just go dark. And compared to the plant next to it, which is still green. And then get your knife out, cut them open, make sure it's blackleg. But the moment you get those darkened branches, we know that's really highly correlated with yield loss. So in the past, we were just saying, get out, look for lesions. No, I don't really think that's a problem anymore. Get out and look for vascular damage. Once you get your eye in, you'll pick up those darkened branches really quickly. Unfortunately, in the birch trials, we saw quite clearly the first time of sowing, we had the darkened branches. On the second and the third time of sowing, we didn't. Same with the genetic resistance. The major gene didn't, the others did. The fungicide treatments, we know all those things worked for birch. Unfortunately, I didn't get the yield response, yield data to back that up. But I'm fairly confident you would have had a yield response to the fungicides last year, but only in the first time of sowing and only on the susceptible cultivars. So I guess they're the things we've got to actually have the knowledge to then make those decisions. But I think it all worked and it's all there. And that's pretty much all I can help you with at the moment. But like I said, hopefully we'll get that genetic resistance ratings to you at some point.
Thanks, Steve. Can I have a round of applause for Steve? Oh, and I've got you. Actually, hang about in case there's any questions. Yeah, I guess getting fungicide management right when there's still a little bit unknown, it's tricky. But as Steve said, hopefully we'll get that upper canopy knowledge around ratings that will really help the decision-making process for sure. Any questions for Genevieve or Steve? No, and nothing on... Oh, hang on. Something from the moderator over there. Thank you. Okay, so why is so much blackleg research done on low-yielding varieties like Bonito? Are they useful trials to inform when making decisions on high-yielding hybrids?
Yep. So we actually don't do any work on Bonito anymore. That was an easy one to answer. We... all our genetic resistance work, all our timing of flowering and that has been done on all cultivars, including the hybrids. The fungicide work we chose we've been doing on Mako because it's an MR cultivar, so we know we'll get a yield response if we get the timings right. So we've really been looking at what are the different regional effects, what are the different timing effects. So do you put it on a 30% bloom or do you put it on first flower or elongation? So to do all that work, we've had to do it on a cultivar we will know we'll get disease. But I agree with you entirely. From now on, we now really need to look at doing it, like I said, different cultivars with all the different resistance ratings. So that is certainly where we're moving. But to be honest, we have done all the genetic stuff on the major genes, which are the hybrids, etc. So it's just the fungicide work we've done on those less resistant cultivars, I guess, because that's what we need to do to start with. The thing I would really like to do probably moving forward this year is actually look at fungicides. Like I said, from our work last year, we actually do have a few cultivars where we know they have different quantitative resistance to upper canopy now, and actually put fungicides on those different cultivars to see if we can get a response. The hard part is we don't have the disease ratings for the cultivars at the moment, so that's going to be very hard to then put that information across to you guys.
Thank you. Very comprehensive, Steve, and thanks, Jen, and sorry for missing your introduction earlier. So that now brings us to lunch. So I just remind everybody that the National Centre for Farmer Health are here and will be conducting health checks for the rest of the afternoon. So if you'd like to jump in, please go and see them. Lunch will be actually served downstairs, so please move downstairs. And just a word of warning, I'll be trying to capture a few people at lunchtime to be involved in a wrap-up session where we talk about what take-home messages or how today's sessions have influenced your decision-making for the coming year. So don't run away from me if I come towards you at lunchtime. And also to Louisa, Louisa has said that there is an evaluation link that we won't be doing evaluations today, we'll be doing it via a link next week. I think it'll be sent out, so we'd really appreciate you providing us your feedback. So I do declare it lunchtime, so enjoy. We'll be back in about an hour. Thanks.